Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who has joined us today from all around the world. I feel extremely honored and privileged to welcome everyone on behalf of Social Science Baha to the 18th Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture. For those of us who may not be familiar with Social Science Baha, it is an independent research organization established with the objective of promoting and enhancing the study of and research in the social sciences in Nepal. Among other events we host, the annual Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture, instituted to honor historian Mahesh Chandra Regmi's seminal contribution to Nepali scholarship, is most definitely our flagship event, eagerly anticipated by many. While we have decided to host the lecture virtually this year, owing to the COVID-19 pandemic that has taken the world by storm and impacted many of our lives in some way or the other, we also see this as an opportunity that has allowed so many of us to gather here today from so many different parts of the world for this important event. This year, we are honored to have with us Dr. Ranabir Samaddar from the Calcutta Research Group, who will shortly be introduced formally. As you are well aware, his lecture is entitled The Present Epidemiological Moment and Biopolitics from Below. And it could not have been delivered at a time more apt than now, when, in the context of COVID-19, the world is experiencing a neo-Malthusian scenario in many countries. I will stop here now and welcome you once again to the lecture. I should also remind you that, as with earlier lectures, we will not be having a Q&A session after the lecture. Hence, the chat feature will remain disabled throughout the lecture so that we can all focus on the lecture with all the attention it deserves. I will now request Mr. Hari Sharma, one of our general members, to formally introduce the speaker. Over to you, Mr. Sharma.
Thank you, Sudeshna. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Ranabir Samaddar, whom I fondly call Ranbir Da. I have known Ranbir Da for many years. I lost the count because it seems to be, forever. He is most lovable man who cares, who understands the South Asia, the plights of poor and destitute. Ranbir Samaddar, currently, as Sudeshna also mentioned, is Distinguished Chair in Migration and Forced Migration Studies, Calcutta Research Group, Kolkata. Formally, in a formal way, it's known as a Manirvan Research Group, but all of us popularly known Calcutta Research Group. And he belongs to the critical school of thinking and considered one of the foremost theorists in the field of migration and forced migration studies. His writings on migration, forms of labor, urbanizations, and political struggles have signaled a new turn in a post-colonial thinking. As you know, when we distributed flyers, his writings are listed there. And among his most influential work, The Marginal Nation, Transborder Migration from Bangladesh to West Bengal. His recent work, which is in my table, Karl Marx and Post-Colonial Age, the crisis of railway strikes and ranks and file beyond Kolkata, Rajarhat dystopia of urban imaginations. Ranbir Da has been, very. He was in Kathmandu in early 90s, especially 95, 96 onward, where we had chance to meet him. And incidentally, the Social Science Baha Himal Association and his station, the South Asian Forum for Human Rights, was also in the same vicinity. We used to see each other. We used to discuss a lot of issues of concerns, refugees, political dissent, everything under the sun. Most especially, I used to enjoy his, ideas or conversation with him on contemporary left politics. I learned quite a lot, and I had chance to read many of his books And although it's not mentioned in the flyer, three books that I wanted to particularly mention, because this is an opportunity to acknowledge Ranbir Das scholarship from my perspective. Um, One is Jungle Mahal, which is a fantastic ethnographic work, because Ranbir Das is currently a critical, known as a critical theorist, but his work is based on all kinds of methodology, empirical observations, and all of these works are standing on its own. For me, Jungle Mahal is one of the wonderful ethnography, and then the marginal nation, which is migrations or boundary questions between Bangladesh and India, is a wonderful data work, observations. And there is another book which I immensely liked, and still I have all his books. So the Autobiography of a Indian Nation, which is a very much of a discourse analysis, how the notion of a nation through the autobiographical perspective. Ranbir Das is a amazing scholar who blends humanities and social science. His writings are informed by literature, folklores, cinema. So that's what he blends, both social sciences and humanities. His writings are not dry. His writings are lucid and beautiful to read. It's my pleasure to know Ranbir Da for over the years. I have learned a lot, and today it's my pleasure to introduce to all of you in this virtual setting. It would have been wonderful if we could have met in Kathmandu with the open audience and mingle with him, listen to him. But we live in a very strange time. So even in this strange time, Social Science Baha wanted to continue with this tradition of holding a Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture annually. So nonetheless, we are at the end of the year, but we're glad, despite all busy schedule, plus given his health recently, Ranbir Da kindly accepted our invitations to come to virtually. A couple of months back, he said that, Hari, this is a very important lecture instituted after the Nepal's foremost political economist, land economist. It would have been better that I could personally deliver in physically deliver this lecture, in the presence of audience, not virtually. But we couldn't do that. We understand Ranbir Da's sentiments. When time comes, Ranbir Da is no stranger to Kathmandu. He has spent years in Kathmandu. He is always welcome to Social Science Baha, and especially in our place. So with these words, I would really like to thank and express my gratitude for Ranbir Da for accepting to deliver 2020 Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture. So with this welcome and introduction, I would like to request Ranbir Da to deliver his lecture. Thank you.
Dear Hari, I am honored by your, extremely gracious and over generous introduction. I am honored to give the Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture of 2020. I have a sense of remorse because during my 5-year stay in Kathmandu, I did not attempt to meet him. I would have learned a lot. The themes of his long inquiries, particularly in land relations, are close to my heart, though I have moved on to other areas in the last 2 decades. I did not know of his association with Kolkata. At least as a Calcuttan, I take this opportunity as a special honor. Also, given the history of the Calcutta Research Group, an autonomous research center set up in 1996 in Kolkata, without any government or corporate help, Regmi's bold initiative to set up a research center resonates in my mind. The least I can say is that his broad range of initiatives of research and documentation has to be emulated by South Asians in this age of neoliberal patronage. He made intellectual inquiry a social practice. Even though I had initially planned to speak on the changing agrarian scenario in the present neoliberal time, and later thought of a related issue, namely the urban turn, The year-long cataclysmic experiences of the pandemic led me to choosing the topic of the current epidemiological crisis and what I term as the biopolitical responses from below. I'm grateful to the organizers for allowing this change of the theme. The present epidemiological moment will prove to be exceptional in many ways. Historians, years later, will be putting their heads down on what may be called the long 2020. War revises the international order. Colonial wars changed political orders in many parts of the world, but we rarely notice to what extent pestilence and massive outbreaks of disease changed the global order. Today, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the world is witnessing a new Malthusian scenario in many countries. So much so that the central question of public health has become the most contentious of the issues of governance. Public health, we know as a concept, is inextricably bound with modern management of the city and broadly managing society. An analysis of the experiences of the government's management of the COVID-19 public health crisis therefore compels us to interrogate our own assumptions of the state, the public, and the government. We have to confront the social and political processes unleashed and accompanied by this or other epidemic, including the imperatives of large-scale planning, organization, coordination, distribution, and delivery of goods and services, as well as regulations on mobility or restrictions on our lives and living. What is unaddressed and silently passed over today in the COVID-19 discourse is namely the question of how things might have been done differently and by whom or with what organization of power. Recall Foucault's discussion of counter-contact, where he wrote, the question is not how not to be governed at all, but rather how not to be governed like that, by that, in the name of certain governmental rationalities and principles. Therefore, we should ask what indeed may be alternate forms of governing life and managing resources towards that. This is where the current epidemiological crisis forces us to confront the existence of social Darwinism in our philosophy of life and neo-Malthusianism as the core of the existing policies on labor and the general management of population. As the context of this talk, I shall begin with the differential burden of the epidemic, and my instances will be predominantly from India. I shall begin briefly with what is known as the migrant crisis today. Within days of the announcement of the nationwide lockdown on 24 March, reports of thousands upon thousands of migrant workers on the roads of India created uproar to bring back all the migrant workers stranded in various states. The Prime Minister gave statements. There were images in the press of an opposition leader talking with the migrants on roadside. State government said, these are our migrants. We shall take them back. Special trains to ferry them back were arranged in June. Some said these were death trains. Hundreds of solidarity initiatives sprang up. The state elections in Bihar last month showed the issue of returning migrant workers had become a public political issue. Yet the question that cropped up remained important. How many migrant workers were on the road across the breadth of this vast country? What was the total number of migrant workers in the country? What was the job-wise breakup of this multitude? How long did they work as migrants? For how many months or years, months in a year or years? Did they return home, and if so, for how many months in a year? Why was the Indian government not aware of the presence of this vast number of migrant workers running into millions upon millions, ranging from a conservative figure of 70 million to a figure of 170 million? Clearly, there was no commonly agreed upon figures as to the state-wise number of the migrant workers. The census, NSS, that's the National Sample Surveys, and other kinds of surveys told only half of the story, for the other half lay in the vast world of undocumented migrant workers, recruited, dispatched, settled, paid wages, dispossessed, dying without enough labor security coverage, in short, bound in a system of informal ties and contract. It will be good to remember that the migrant workers have been the motor of India's logistical development in these 2 decades of our century, from working in the booming waste pre-processing industry to construction of ports, highways, airports, toll plazas, new towns, smart cities, to laying cables under the sea, informal and artisanal mining, to setting up fast corridors and digital infrastructure. However, logistical development is always a matter of circulation of capital and commodities, hence less visible in the public sphere. Logistical development and informal labor are like Siamese twins. Formal economy and economic theory do not recognize this inseparable but invisible link. GDP growth is visible in the modern economic discourse. However, migrant labor engaged in a variety of logistical activities is not. Interesting was the case of ignoring by the highest court of the land and the central government of the Interstate Migrant Workmen Regulation of Employment and Conditions of Service Act of 1979. When the Great Migrants' March back home was happening, the Act, though inadequate, was in place. The Act had made the registration of migrant workers mandatory with the state from which an interstate migrant worker was recruited and in the state in which the worker was employed. The provisions of the Act stipulated certain obligations on governments and private employers. In case of non-compliance with the Act, there was a provision for punishment of imprisonment up to 1 year and in some other cases 2 years. Yet it was clear that governments had not taken it seriously. In the absence of realistic data about migrant workers spread across the country, it was difficult, therefore, to authenticate the claim that the Union government made in its status report to the Supreme Court that the migrants' problems had been adequately addressed by the government. Reports coming from the ground spoke of distress calls in the first 21 days of lockdown. One report found that about 96% of them did not receive ration, 70% of them did not get any cooked food, and 89% of them were not paid by their employers during the lockdown. Reports mentioned immediate issues of food security, wages and income support, social security, shelter and housing, and transportation facilities for migrant workers. There were reports also on the need for urban employment guarantees and expanding the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Likewise, there were demands of provisioning minimum consumption and a minimum standard of living for the migrant workers and their families. Reports also spoke of the necessity of recognizing informal migrant settlements, as well as legal obligations of urban local bodies to take cognizance of the presence of migrant workers in cities through mapping of migrant dense areas so that provisions mentioned above were available. Some pointed out that there was an urgent need for a special NSS round on migration to estimate the number, nature of migration, and the status of security and protection for the migrants. In brief, invisibility had led to the denial of labor rights and the security of life. The situation further aggravated as a number of petitions filed before the Supreme Court were rejected and disposed of without giving any credence to them. Incidents of unrest and violence in Surat, Mumbai, and elsewhere showed that migrants were in urgent need of both cash transfer and food. Indeed, despite the obvious magnitude of the migrant worker crisis, the issue of stranded migrant workers throughout the country did not make it to the list of 11 task groups constituted by the Ministry of Home Affairs in the wake of the lockdown. Only when the migrant workers defied the lockdown and came down on the streets to march back home, hundreds of kilometers away, their precarious situation became visible to mainstream politics. Workers met the economic package offered by the state by simply walking off. In thousands upon thousands from every corner of the country, a veritable general strike in a ghostly form. We thus need to study the bourgeois dynamics of visibility and invisibility. Till that time, invisible in politics, the migrant worker was visible in economy. Now, when the economy discarded them, the migrant workers gained political attention as they suddenly turned into a problem. Till then, political subjectivity had been denied to migrant labor so that the neoliberal agenda could proceed smoothly. The chaotic evolution labeled as the migrant crisis in India was also the unveiling of the bourgeois order of visibility and invisibility. Within 3 months of the migrant crisis, literally through the pandemic months, the government, utilizing the lockdown, silence, and fear of death due to COVID, and the overall immobilization of society, tried to push through a range of reforms, substituting GST, that is goods and services tax, dues to the states by asking them to take loans from the Reserve Bank, labor deregulation, privatization of education, railways, public health, and other public resources, opening up the agriculture of the country for foreign trade and withdrawal of controls related to essential commodities that guarantee food security, imposing restrictive monetary policies. All these were steps related to the declared aim to invigorate the economy. Along with these measures, the government pushed through the parliament the Agricultural Reforms Bill, throwing open food grains to the complete freedom of the market. All in all, COVID-19 crisis produced severe disruptions in labor's life and process, while it offered the rulers an opportunity to push through the neoliberal reforms further. In this context, questions of economy became a matter of life for millions of petty producers, informal labor, including migrant labor, peasants, and other sections of society. The metamorphosis of economic questions into those of life had never been as evident as it was in the time of the pandemic. Yet, one has to notice the paradox. The life question appeared in a roundabout way. The central issue in the epidemiological crisis and the resultant crisis of life should have been public health. However, public health had no place in the reforms agenda. Life was indeed naked for the migrant worker caught in the lockdown and thrown out of a job with no access to public health, say respirator, or an intensive care unit bed because of a collapsed health system. We must therefore understand the significance of the government's approach to the public health crisis during the epidemic. It was a law and order approach epitomized in the invocation of the Colonial Epidemic Diseases Act, known as the Plague Act of 1897, and the Disaster Management Act of 2005. The approach shunned the path of building a social response to disease management. The old adage appeared to haunt the country once again: never let a crisis go west. The crisis had to produce a restructuring of economy. Public health crisis was the occasion. Social Darwinism and new Malthusian population policies combined to produce an India that could claim that with quote and unquote minimum loss, the country had been saved and brought back from the age of disaster. Biopolitics, I submit, emerged in the context of this breakdown of life. The characteristic of the moment of an epidemiological crisis is that it bears the fetishist nature of modern representational politics. Politics is produced out of struggles of life, yet the representational dynamic severs the link between politics and life. Politics, and here we are speaking of representational politics, seems to have a mysterious property which puts it above life. Politics as a phantasmagoria determines life relations as relations between various aspects of political life. However, epidemic, which is a massive outbreak of a disease threatening human life in the most direct and starkest way, upsets this order of fantasy. In the time of an epidemic, as during a famine, life's fault lines in the form of caste, race, gender, age, differential entitlement regime, property system, employment structure, public-private relation are compounded hundredfold, exposing the mythical nature of liberal representational system and norms of governance. Biopolitics, in some sense, attempts to move away from the liberal representational form of politics and restore the direct relation between life and politics by removing or drastically reducing representational devices and other mediations, and by the same token, change the mode of governing life. This is the first meaning of biopolitics from below. Biopolitics from above is the politics of states and governments to focus on the health and lives of the people in order to continue and maximize production, reap greater profit as biocapital accumulates, particularly in the wake of the diseases, in the form of medicines, investigative institutions, the race for vaccines, etc., and to ensure conditions of human reproduction and thereby social stability. Biopolitics from above aims to determine the pattern of human life from the angle of productivity and thus continues neo-Malthusian policies of population management. Necessarily, therefore, certain sections of population are to be periodically sacrificed. Neoliberal techniques such as governing on the basis of the social policies on health, education, skill enhancement, poverty management, etc., aim to escape the two binds of Malthusianism and Darwinism by trying to flexibilize and draw the so-called unproductive sections of population like the aged, invalid, the poor, the migrant, the lazy, the unskilled into the nexus of market and make them productive. Yet, this hope is often unfounded or at least at best realized partially and at great cost. Epidemic, like the famine, brutally exposes the fragile biopolitical basis of modern rule. An epidemic disrupts the biopolitical foundation of modern administration. Not strangely, the migrant became the most difficult figure in the neoliberal enterprise of reconciling market and security of life. The difficulty was and is how will the government accommodate the migrant worker in its strategy of containment of virus and restructuring the economy? At the same time, this situation lends biopolitics a new possibility, that of reorganizing human life along new lines. Biopolitics from above meets its adversary in the form of biopolitics from below. In one, the measure of politics hold over life may be the latter's confinement, deprivation, destitution, and misery. On the other hand, the measure of life hold over life's hold over politics is its impact on the latter in the form of organization of care, solidarity, collectivism. In short, politics starts treating life as a commons. However, only in particular moments in history of modern politics we find these two forms of biopolitics meeting each other face to face. These are the exceptional moments of crisis. We must therefore understand the exceptional nature of our time when epidemiological crisis magnifies hundredfold as it meets an acute financial crisis and a political crisis. The figure of the migrant became, in this critical moment, the emblem of biopolitics from below. Biopolitics from below, I argue, stands in direct contrast to the liberal democratic obsession with the public. For as the COVID-19 crisis in India and elsewhere showed, there was no undifferentiated public facing the epidemic. Thus, no uniform public health system, no uniform public access to resources such as food and job, but a public that represents perhaps what Pierre Rosanvallon would have called a continuous history of democratic disappointment. In fact, epidemic and the biopolitics of the epidemic interrogate the received history of the political. We should then put the issue of biopolitics contextually. In this case, the context of crisis around the virus. The crisis was already building for 12 years since the recession and bank bailouts, with the desperate talks of stimulus and paradoxically policies of austerity. And only 5 years ago, the Paris Agreement on climate change had signaled the global economy of an urgent need to pay attention to the life world of the humans. By early March 2020, the spread of the novel coronavirus was declared by the WHO as a global pandemic. Scores of countries declared lockdown measures to curb the spread. Already crisis-ridden, the global economy recoiled from neo-mercantilism in the form of speedy circulation of labor, commodities, capital, and services, thus further hurtling down the path of disaster. The situation was reflected most in the abandonment by governments of welfare-oriented social policies, even more marginalization of migrants and refugees, destitution of low-wage section of laboring population suffering from food insecurity, massive reduction of organization of labor force, and and uh, most importantly, an acute crisis in public health structures around the world struggling under neoliberal management of public health. The public health crisis only deepened the crisis of the economy. The incomes of the wage earning groups went down, and public spending on social services declined, and by all available estimates, the earnings of the corporate sector went up. The issue clearly became not only, as Samir Amin had prophetically put it, a question of not only virus, but a neoliberal virus. The moment was and still remains one of public health emergency. The issue is thus one of life. Amidst the crippled condition of public health, public services under neoliberal regimes, people are realizing that there is far more value in the universal public services than what they pay in taxes. In times of a grave health crisis like a pandemic, public services matter more. The deficit hysteria, asking for even further privatization, reduction of public health services and jobs underscore the severe effects of COVID-19 crisis. In this milieu, marked by a specific pattern of capital investment and deployment of power that sucks blood from the disaster-struck population, biopolitics from above gathers strength, biocapital and biopolitics and biopower stem from life's crisis. Yet, the crisis of life produces and must produce political response. Biopolitics from below is not so much about the below as against the above, but above multiple scales, local, community level, state level, national level, as well as occupation centric. These multiple scales speak of the need of a new type of public power. Biopolitics from below is a form of politics that encourages us to think along new lines of protecting life. It is not about new issues of life, but about how issues hitherto considered as belonging to the high world of governance transform into issues of life. Biopolitics from below is concerned with the truth of life and death. Of course, you may question, has not politics been all along concerned with issues of life? So, what is new or specific to our time? Yet, politics, at least from the day it became a mass affair, became gradually mired in issues of representation, policies, laws and regulations, and above all, took upon itself the responsibility of facilitating the market, private interests and property, and in this sense, economy, while it all along happily left the issues of bare life to common people for them to manage. It is this mode of politics which faced a dead end as the virus struck. The debauchery of politics was exposed. The absence of its responsibility to life was laid bare. It also became clear that liberal politics and market economy could protect life only up to an extent. The concern had been only to turn living labor into the most productive element of capital, accumulating capital in a specific way by way of capitalizing on issues of population health, thus massive corporate investments in medicine, healthcare in place of public health, diagnostics, biomedical research, medical education, and forging the tools of governance to ordain the health of a collective, which we call population, in the form of a certain regime. In this milieu, public health, like the migrant question, became the occasion for the emergence of biopolitics from below, which signaled attempts to once again link politics with life, life's protection and survival without the mediation of capital. But the biopolitics we are speaking of here is thus not a transcendental category. The politics of life is the politics of a specific moment of crisis The moment is specific because of two reasons. A, the conjunction of three crises, the economic, political, and the epidemiological, and B, the particular way in which the life question of millions of people has emerged. One reason behind the sense of chaos in today's epidemiological management is that capitalism and bourgeois politics in general always think that they face dangers from within, quote, the outside, and therefore it is outside the bourgeois historical sense. The virus is from outside. China is also outside. The crisis has not originated from the inside. The bourgeois understands war, to some extent famine, again to some extent climate change, but an epidemic. Its sure-footedness is noticeably absent in this case. This is because the life question appears as one suddenly emerging from outside the system. It raises its head as a crisis of a process of accumulation which combines the primitive and the financial virtue. In brief, the epidemic brings to the fore the issue of life with three invocations: the safety of the biological life of the person, the life of a collective called a population, and finally, the life world of the people. Bourgeois historical knowledge never addressed such a crisis. The crisis of bourgeois knowledge flows from its inability to negotiate the life question. It still has no anchor except neo-Malthusianism and a social Darwinist approach to global history, notwithstanding the welfareist phase of capitalism. In this sense, Michel Foucault was perhaps wrong when he linked the progress of liberalism with putting its stakes on saving lives in place of asserting the right of the republic to proclaim death. In a way, it is still the right of the capitalist class to adjudicate the number of deaths and the number of lazy and the unproductive. The life question has arrived in this minute. The period of lockdown brought home this truth more than anything else. Thus, safe and unsafe areas were negotiated by thousands of supply workers, housemaids, cleaners, waste disposal employees, foodstuff and vegetable vendors, maintenance staff of electricity and other urban utilities who transited the borders of lockdown. Their jobs reflected the constant refrain of neoliberal capitalism, namely, keep things moving, keep the supply chain clear of cumbersome elements of human life, congested space, traffic jams, and of course, contagion, a discussion with which Deborah Cohen's The Deadly Life of Logistics resonates. Thus, as we know, ports functioned, seafarers remained offshore, with a new border appearing between those who were shut indoors and those who remained outside the boundary lines of safety and security. To biopolitics from above, the collective body or the corporeal existence of a disease-stricken population seems therefore at one level to the bourgeoisie endowed with magical powers of cure, some perhaps illusory, but some which can and must be known by bourgeois sciences. The disease-stricken population, appearing in form of numbers and percentages, appears and disappears. On some occasions, appears invincible. In short, possessing a sort of transmateriality, as the slum-dwelling population of India is thought to have. The migrant characteristically carries this occult quality. Did the migrant carry the disease? Did the migrant become the medium of contagion? Did the migrants melt in the ocean of population? Did not the migrant population carry certain signs and represent to the rulers spots and zones of dark enclaves of poverty, intractability, disease, joblessness, and in the unending burden on the state to feed a vast amorphous mass of bodies waiting on the breadline? Perhaps, therefore, the migrant proved the most difficult problem for the calculative regime of capital. Yet, for neoliberalism, it must always be a matter of determining the ratio. This is how disaster capitalism works. In this context, lockdown and unlocking became the key words to understand the situation more than hospitals, beds, kits, tests, medicines, doctors, nurses, deaths, slums, migrant workers, conservancy workers. In this unlocking of life, in India at least, reopening of schools and colleges assumed critical importance. With social distancing, real and imaginary, appearing as the crucial question of life, every collective space had to be now reconfigured in terms of individualized safety that would hereafter restructure social relations. In this context, the life question occupied the central space in the debates over the Union government's determination to unlock the society by holding examination in the field of national technical education like medical, engineering, computer sciences, business administration, biotechnological sciences. The debate was now perched on the issue of safety of life, lives of students. And as against the issue of lives of students was posed the need to continue the academic calendar as the core of educational activities. As the judges in India famously asked, how long shall we wait for the corona to pass over? Education should be opened up. COVID may continue for a year more. Are you going to wait for another year? Do you know what is the loss to the country and the career peril to the students? Asked a judge. We can see how the issue of health underwent a metamorphosis in this period. In the new biopolitical milieu we are discussing here, health did not mean so much medicine, cure, and well-being as it meant a particular regime of life and death, and hence it evoked discussions on the number of available ventilators, personal protective equipment, anxiety the world over during the waiting period of the vaccine, models on infection rate, supposed physical immunity of a population to virus infection, a phenomenon known as herd immunity, bodily resilience of an individual in face of the death-causing virus, and similar other themes relating to the chiaroscuro of life and death, so much so that the issue of health became at once the individualized physical life and at the same time the security of a population. In fact, the inadequacy of the public health structure brought out the life question inexorably. Three factors stood out as elements of an inadequate public health response to the crisis. A, its one size fits all approach that over relied on administrative and police methods. B, the narrow focus on what is known as community medicine as part of public health. And C, lack of proper research on biomedical interventions. In a recent commentary, two writers termed these three features as the blind spots of public health and noted these features have seen the anticipated threat of COVID-19 turn into an actual and widespread hunger, anxiety, and physical distress. A greater part of the scenario lay in the overdependence of public health officials and rulers in general on the received epidemic-centric statistical modeling exercises. These exercises determine the narratives of probable caseloads and number of deaths. These also blinded the public health community to local specific situations and the need for reasonable and planned response. Viral transmission appeared as a sovereign process, the knowledge of which could be found only from these modeling exercises. On the other hand, historical experiences of countries saving lives were ignored. The life question became paramount through a series of crises in the public health structure. The immobilization of mainstream politics during this crisis calls for scrutiny, not because it shows that politics faces periods of powerlessness, but what it can do to overcome such a condition. Indeed, like political defeats, the outbreak of diseases in the past proved to be an occasion for the weak to find ways to circumvent the position of weakness. The great instance is, of course, Lenin's famous wartime cry as the typhus broke out in revolutionary Russia. In his words, either socialism will defeat the Laos or the Laos will defeat socialism. With this slogan, as we know, he launched a massive mobilization against typhus from which was born the legendary Soviet public health system. Closer to our country, towards the end of the 19th century, a band of monks led by Swami Vivekananda came down to the streets of the plague-ravaged Kolkata to clean the city. Tagore, a few years later, composed his famous essays on water scarcity in Bengal to say that the region was dependent on colonial mercy, and he urged Bengal to be self-reliant and undertake public initiative-driven water works on a massive scale. Even the 50s of the last century, the first decade of independence of a just born nation, with its history of malaria control and eradication, at least for the time being, has something to offer as a lesson for us. Public health agenda, social mobilization, militant philanthropy, solidarity with migrant workers, new thinking on federalization, food security, employment, these have only been some of the issues that suggested the possibility of a new way of thinking that can prise open the situation. The courage of uncertainty, as opposed to the certainty of surviving in banal politics, is a way to reconceptualize life. The emerging leadership of what may be called militant philanthropy and solidarity was evident all over India during the countrywide lockdown. It told us of the courage of uncertainty. The courage of uncertainty gestures at the idea of strength of politics that goes beyond moral enfeeblement, that grows out of a mode of somehow surviving in a contentious time. I now come to the concluding section. Biopolitics from below is not new in modern human history. This discussion had brief references to wars and famines. However, I admit that biopolitics from below is still an inadequately studied form of politics and even less theorized. It is also rarely studied by conventional left and mainstream politics, as the left is also steeped in parliamentary mode of politics and old ideas of representation. One may say politics from below has always been non-representational, largely biological, physical, material, always mandated by the question of life, its survival. We may recall Antonio Gramsci's words, the absolute, the earthliness of thought. Today, in the context of the pandemic of COVID-19, as the world witnesses a resurgence of a new Malthusian scenario, we can notice ground level responses of a different order, which tell us only the faint form, the vision of a new politics of life, and the importance of care in a transformed politics. In this context, we must refer to the question of a new type of public power, which values care as the guiding principle of organizing society, which will be treated as the commons. What will be the new mode of power in that scenario? All we can say of that transformative scenario is that the imaginary of a new type of power that runs things differently, assures protection to its people, discharges responsibility for the safety, security, and well-being of its people, and is compassionate, exactly the opposite of neoliberal trait. In short, a new combination of autonomy, history, and politics. Trust will be an important element in protecting society as a common resource. It will be a new organization, a new physics of governing space, the as far as possible elimination of the intermediaries in the task of protection who strut in front of us in the form of government mandarins like the bureaucrats and traditional parliamentary representatives. With the epic return of the migrants and solidarity initiatives around the return constituted a great biopolitical act from below, we must take into account other facts. As soon as the pandemic struck and the country was locked down, many state governments in India immediately turned their attention to providing food to the lockdown populations in their respective states. Food security suddenly became the top priority for local governments, panchayats, municipalities, corporations, state governments. This attention did not originate from a sense of popular rights, but from a sense of obligation, a duty to protect the people who may starve en masse. Tackling hunger in the wake of the long lockdown became a secular process all along the lower levels of power and politics. At the same time, local solidarities emerged with a spirit of militant philanthropy. Countless activists, trade unionists, local councillors, notables, academics, students and youth, village leaders, philanthropists, political cadres and do-gooders joined hands or formed independent groups to come to the aid of migrant workers, out-of-job informal workers, and other needy sections of society, as if protection and solidarity had combined as ideas and guiding motives in an upsurge of activism in protest against the sudden lockdown. Perhaps plagued by the uncertainty of organized political institutions in responding to the impending danger, solidarity became the way by which social leadership would face the threat of the virus and the uncertain future. At the same time, in slums and other hamlets of poor urban population groups, local clubs and some of the toughs running these clubs assume the role of local vigilance protecting the settlements. These clubs put in place a routine for all women who have to go out daily on work, schedule of departure and return, monitoring the entry of outsiders, which included even close relatives, erecting bamboo gates to protect the settlements, distributing sanitization material, arranging with local police station and municipal authority cleaning of common facilities like washing and bathing 3 to 4 times a day, autonomous self-organized efforts from solidarity initiatives to erecting protection in front of bastis ranged an incredibly broad spectrum. At the same time, male labor in these settlements thrown out of work consequent to the lockdown had to readjust. Newly engaged in subaltern logistical services of the gig economy and vending all kinds of goods like including fish and vegetables, their flexible work routine too had to be adjusted to the needs of security. Several reports confirm the presence of awareness among the lower class in greater degree to the threat of the virus than what it was among the affluent middle classes. Newer forms of organization was evident among the care workers and caregivers. In India, what is called ASHA workers, that is accredited social health activists, AYAs, nurses and doctors, joined in thousands at cities and municipalities the efforts at self-organization, though once again, several fault lines were there, making the mobilization process a contentious one. These autonomous activities, we should not be surprised, bore the imprint of older power relations, while newer power relations were forged. Biopolitics from below thus bore the dual nature of power. Yet what came out of these early signs of a new form of biopolitics can be captured in three models. The Dharavi model, which is preferably the biggest slum in Asia of self-organization and protection. The Bengal model, where access to food was given the highest priority by a populist administration, and the Kerala model, where social mobilization along planned lines and municipal awareness averted large number of deaths. None of these models, or more correctly, historical efforts was perfect. All of these places saw the return or the spread of infection, yet they were able not only to avert greater casualties, they indicated new forms of biopolitics from below. At the level, at only and only down the levels of hierarchy of power could such efforts at self-organization be mounted. Together, they tell us the characteristics of a new form of public power, which would be a dialogic power. This was the politics of life. The historical genealogy of biopolitics from below will have to take into account the dynamics of these encounters and engagements with the virus. I wish we could draw a rosier picture of biopolitics from below, but make no mistake, the politics of life being forged in a new way before our eyes will be a fundamental feature of politics in the COVID-19 age, by which I mean an age where neoliberalism will be pitted against a new politics of life. No radical politics will be able to proceed if it fails to accommodate and articulate the new politics of life. The absence of the life issue marks biopolitics from above. The presence of the life issue and the mediation of politics by life questions marks biopolitics from below. In this age of neo-Malthusianism, politics of life will be the crucial factor in determining human history. The virus, which is the outsider, is propelling the human history of our time. I want to thank all of you for your patience with this rambling talk, which is based on a small book I am now currently working, professionally named as An Epidemic and the Politics of Life, to be published by the Women Unlimited. Hopefully, that book will be more cogent. I want to thank you once again. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Samaddar. I believe I will be speaking for everyone when I say that listening to your lecture today has been truly illuminating. Your vision of a new politics of life, which values care as the guiding principle of organizing society, is compelling and has given us all something to ruminate over. While we will not unfortunately be able to interact with each other like we would have had this lecture not been a virtual one, I would like to say that you can reach out to Dr. Samaddar personally should you want to discuss the ideas presented today in further detail. I would also like to remind you that you will also be able to access the video recording and the printed version of the lecture on our website soon. Thank you once again, Dr. Samaddar, Mr. Sharma, and all the participants for joining us today. We are immensely grateful for your support and encouragement in keeping alive the spirit and the tradition of the Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture, despite the trying circumstances we find ourselves in. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.